Okay, so we are back in chapter 2. There we go. In Roman numeral 3, research designs and personality. So we did Roman numeral 1 and 2 last lecture, so we're picking up. If you didn't listen to the first part of chapter 2, you need to go back and listen to that first, and then pick up with Roman numeral 3 here. So here's where we are now. Now we're going to talk about actually how do you design studies, different ways to look at different aspects of personality. And just a little note, we're going to cover this in a slightly different order than your textbook does, but because it just makes a lot more sense to switch it to the way we are, in my opinion, and I think you'll agree after we finish the chapter. You'll see why we start with correlation methods. And that's where we are going to start. So let's start with correlation methods and right into the definition of correlation. Just looking at the word, you already know what it means. Co means two or more, co, and relation. So it's the relationship between two or more variables, but we'll shorten it to say two variables. So the relationship between two variables is a co-relation, or as we pronounce it, correlation. So correlation is just simply whether two variables have a relationship. And to say that they have a relationship, what that means is if I know something about one variable, if that can help me predict something about the other variable. Knowing something about one, I can then predict the other. I'll give you two variables here that research does suggest. These are strongly correlated. And what it means is, if I know about either one of these, success in college or SAT, I can then predict something about the other variable. Because administrators, the reason that we do SAT scores is because administrators feel that if they know a student's SAT scores, then they can predict that student's success in college down the road. Because it turns out these two variables are strongly correlated, meaning knowing about one can help you predict the other. And by the way, I'm going to take a second here to talk about all the research we're going to talk about this entire semester. I think you realize this. Any research that gets published does not get published because 100% of the subjects behaved in a certain way. That's not really very realistic at all. So we look at research where the majority of subjects behaved in a certain way. So what that means is you're always going to know exceptions in your own life. So you may know somebody who had terrible SAT scores, but they did great in college, or they had great SAT scores and they did terrible in college. You may know exceptions, but I got to tell you, statistically speaking, the variables that we're going to talk about this semester do tend to present or represent the data in general, not 100%, but the majority of subjects. So, that being said, if these two variables are indeed correlated, which research suggests they are, knowing something about either one would help us predict the other. So if you know something about SAT scores, you can then predict success in college. If you know about success in college, you can then go back and predict what their previous SAT scores probably were. And we're not going to range it, so you're not going to go to the specific number, but you might do a pretty good job. That's what it means to be correlated. One variable helps us predict the other. Oh, and by the way, you see the arrow goes both ways. It doesn't matter which variable we start with. Based on the statistical analysis done in correlation analysis, knowing about one can predict the other. So it doesn't matter which one you start with. If they are indeed correlated, you can then predict the other. Okay, so if you look in your outline, there's a little A and a little B, positive correlation and negative correlation. There are two ways that these variables can be correlated. So the first we'll talk about is called positive correlation, and the definition is on the PowerPoint. High values of one variable are associated with high values on the other. You see that both highs are italicized, so in your notes, underline them both, because that matters. High with high, or low values of one variable are associated with low values on the other. Low with low. They agree. So I recommend you assign arrows, by the way, and when you do, you'll notice that if they're positively correlated, arrows agree in direction. Meaning, if we look at the examples I put up here, extroversion and social outings. turns out research suggests that as the amount of extroversion or how high a group scores on extroversion ratings, the higher those ratings become, the more social outings we tend to see in those groups of people. So the more extroverted people are, the more social outings they tend to go on. See how the arrows go in the same direction? But by the way, I could flip those both upside down, and I would have to flip them both. Because as extroversion goes down, the number of social outings also decreases. These arrows will always agree in direction because they're positively correlated variables. Meaning when one goes up, the other goes up, one goes down, the other goes down. They just always agree. Like on the right, that example. Number of hours studied and grade on an exam. Again, you might know exceptions, but in general, research finds that these two are also positively correlated. Meaning, when one is low, the other's low. When the number of hours studied is low, the grade on that exam tends to be low. And you can flip them both up too. If the number of hours studied is high, the grade on the exam tends to be high. They're positively correlated because they agree in direction. So both of these are examples of positively correlated variables because there's agreement in the direction that these variables move. If there's an increase in one, the other increases. If it decreases, the other one decreases. And that's positive correlation. So negative correlation, high values on one variable are associated with low values on the other. High with low. And it doesn't matter which one you start with. If one is high, the other value is low. The arrows do not agree. There we go. Arrows do not agree in direction. So if you look at the example on the left, I use this example because I think everybody knows about this little company called Starbucks. So Starbucks started in the northwest of America in a pretty temperate zone, meaning they don't get really hot summers, they don't get cold winters, and they wanted to know, could we take this model and go to places like Miami or Austin, Texas, and can we still charge this really high amount of money for a cup of hot coffee? Because at the time when they started, they only made hot coffee. It turns out when they looked at correlational data, the hotter it got, so if you look here, the hotter it gets, the lower hot coffee sales are. And you might know exceptions to this. My husband will drink hot coffee even if it's 105 degrees outside, it doesn't matter. But he's an exception, it turns out. The majority of people don't want to buy hot coffee when it's really hot outside. So as temperature goes up, hot coffee sales go down. And Starbucks said, uh-oh, how are we going to make it in these hot climates and still turn a profit? So I think you probably know some genius in their ranks decided to create iced coffee as a sellable item, and frappuccino, and they whip it up and they create something really great, and that coffee knows what's in there. But so they created the cold coffee sales to counteract this negative correlation, because this is what the data showed them. And if you look on the other side, here's two examples again, two variables as another example of negative correlation. As the amount of extroversion in a group goes up, it turns out the amount of quiet study time they participate in is actually quite low. And you could flip those arrows either, anytime if you flip one arrow, you got to flip the other. So as the amount of quiet study time increases, the extroversion levels of that group or that person would decrease. You notice in both of these examples, because they're both examples of negative correlation, that the arrows do not agree in direction. And it doesn't matter which one is going up, the other goes down. And if you want to flip that one up, the other one flips down. They do not and will not agree in direction. As values go up for one, they will go down for the other. And that's a negative correlation. So it sounds like, I think you got it. So this is an example of a negative correlation. And in your notes, I want you to take a turn. I'm going to start this off. I'm going to give you one variable, and I'm going to say it's alcohol consumption. And I want you to give me another variable that is negatively, in your opinion, negatively correlated with the first variable, which is alcohol consumption. So I want you to write this example in your notes. Alcohol consumption and another variable. And I want you to pick another variable that you believe is negatively correlated with alcohol consumption. And I'll give you a minute to do that. And while you're thinking of one, you need to remember, this suggests, because we're saying they're negatively correlated, as alcohol consumption increases, what happens to that other variable? It's going to decrease, right? Because they're negatively correlated. The arrows will go in opposite directions. So you could come up with lots of ideas here. So I'll tell you some of the ideas some of my students always give me. As alcohol consumption increases, decision-making decreases, or inhibitions decrease. And that actually, I would believe, is supported by research as well. But the one that I thought of was this, reaction time. That as alcohol consumption increases, reaction time decreases. And it turns out that's a very strong negative correlation, so much so that we are considered impaired drivers after so much alcohol, because it's so strongly correlated with lower reaction times, which, when you're driving, makes us worse drivers. So that's a negative correlation. As one goes up, the other goes down. Okay. All right. Load all these on here. Our examples. Here we go. So again, look at the arrows. So, to kind of sum this out. If they're positively correlated, two variables, look at the two examples of positive correlation. You notice that their arrows agree in direction. As values of one goes up, the other also goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. And again, you can flip any arrow, you just got to flip the other one, because they will always agree. So as extroversion decreases in a group, number of social outings will also decrease. They just agree in direction. And then if you look at the negative correlation, those arrows do not agree in direction. As one goes up, the other goes down. Okay, now something that to be said about a correlation in general is that we often use this in psychology, and you'll see these reported in the news, in magazines, oftentimes in magazines, and on the internet, all the time, on TV, and in journals. When you're reading real peer-reviewed journal articles, you're going to see correlations reported. And here's what you need to realize is that they're very powerful in that they let us see relationships between variables, but there's a limitation to that. We're just looking at data that exists. We're not manipulating the data. We could look at, for example, they didn't go and manipulate the temperature and then look at hot coffee sales. They just looked at months where the temperature was high, and they started looking at hot coffee sales in that region at that time. They didn't go in and tweak anything. They're just looking at the numbers that exist. And that is one of the beauties of correlation. They're easy to do. So for example, if I wanted to look at the correlation between the diagnosis of PTSD and the close proximity to the 9/11 attacks in New York City, or anywhere where there's a situation on 9/11. If you wanted to look to see if there's a correlation with the amount of people who are diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, is that the number of diagnosed people, is it correlated with how close they were physically lived to one of the three sites where 9/11 had major impact in America? You could look at that data, and you could do, and by the way, that data has been looked at, and there is a strong correlation, and it is a positive correlation. The closer somebody lived to one of the sites where there was an attack, the higher the rates of PTSD are in that region. I can't go in and manipulate anything there. I can't make up uh, a traumatic event. I can't do that. I'm just looking at data that already exists. And when I do that, oh, it comes with a certain flexibility in that I can look at lots of different variables at one time. But there's also some limitations, and the limitation is I don't manipulate anything. I'm just looking at the data. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So, positive and negative correlations. I think we got that. Now we're going to go to this idea in that line of how do we look at what is a correlation? How does it get represented to us? Well, it's through a correlation coefficient, and that's defined as a statistic that indicates two things, strength and direction of a correlation. And if I were you, I'd underline those two terms that are italicized. It's really important to remember that a correlation coefficient is a statistic or a number that indicates two things, strength and direction of a correlation. And we're going to talk about strength and direction, as you can see, in a minute. But right now, we're going to talk a little bit more in general about what a correlation coefficient is. So first of all, I put it's a number. That's what it means when it says it's a statistic. It's a number. And it ranges from -1 to +1. So on a number line, you can go as low as -1 and as high as +1, but you can't go outside of that range. You can't go lower than -1 or higher than +1. If you do, if you get a correlation coefficient that's out of that range, your computer's broken. The reason being is -1 and +1 are perfect correlations, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. It can't be outside of that range. So that's something important to remember, that correlation coefficient is a number, and that number will always fall between -1 and +1. It can equal -1 and it can equal +1, but it can't go lower than -1 or higher than +1. But it can be anything in between them. It could be equal to those or anything in between. The next thing I want you to remember is it's represented to us as a lowercase r, and they italicize the r when you see it in print. It's a lowercase italicized r, and that's what it will look like to us. So if I have a number line like this, see how it goes all the way to -1 and up to +1, but nowhere else. Boom, that's it. And anything on that line is fair game. Anything. If I put some examples, you can have a correlation coefficient equal to -1. You can have one equal to 0. You can have one equal to +1. -0.67, +0.81. I just made examples. It can fall anywhere in this range. And this is what they look when they report it. They report like this. Italicized lowercase r equals, and then a number and a sign. There's always a sign. And by the way, if there is no sign, that sign doesn't have to be there, does it? If there is no sign, you assume it's positive. Remember back to math? If it's negative, the negative sign will always be there, but if it's positive, there may be no sign at all. Okay, so let's go now, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what these numbers mean and the signs mean in a moment. But let's talk about those two important areas that it tells us about, strength and direction. So we said a correlation coefficient tells us about strength. First, we have to say strength. What is it? It's how much these variables are correlated. How confident are we in our prediction? Remember, correlations are all about relationships and prediction. How confident are we in our prediction of the second variable? If we know about the first variable, how confident are we to predict the second? If we're very confident, we do a great job predicting, we say that we have a strong correlation. If we're not that confident, if we don't do a great job predicting, if we're guessing, we say we have a weak correlation. If we have no ability to predict at all, and we're just guessing, we say we have no correlation. They're not correlated. One doesn't tell us about the other. They just simply don't have a correlation. They're not correlated. There's no relationship. One doesn't help us predict. So that has everything to do with strength. Direction, let me just peek ahead real quick. Direction tells us about what type of correlation this is, positive or negative. So as the value of one increases, what happens to that other one? If it's a positive correlation, if one value of a variable increases, the other one will also increase. And if it goes down, it will also go down, if it is a positive correlation. If it's a negative, you know that as one goes up, the other is going to go down. And it doesn't matter which one you start with, the other one's going to go in the opposite direction if they are indeed negatively correlated. So the correlation coefficient, that little number, tells us a ton. Tells us, first, how confident are we in our prediction? And two, what type of correlation? What direction? Is it a positive or negative correlation? So here's something really interesting. This is a really important slide. You might need to pause this and just kind of let this all sink in and get this all written down. The number. So if you look down here, I underlined and put in red just the number. See, I didn't make the sign red. I just put in red and underlined the numbers of the correlation coefficient. That number is what tells us the strength. The strength is represented in the number. And the larger the number, the stronger the relationship. Meaning, the better our predictive value is. If we know about one, we can predict better the other variable. And by the way, in a number line, when we're looking at strength, you just want to get away from zero. It doesn't matter whether you go up away or down away. Get away from zero, because the larger the number, the stronger the relationship. And again, we don't care about sign. So disregard sign. Just get away from zero. Get away from zero, and the strength goes up. If you are at zero, there is no strength, meaning you're guessing. One does not predict the other. These two variables have no relationship. Again, we're talking if you get a correlation coefficient equal to zero. There is no relationship between these two variables, meaning one cannot help you predict the other. I'll give you an example. Shoe size in adults and IQ. If I know the shoe size of my classroom, I cannot then predict the average IQs of these people, because they're not correlated. I've got no predictive value if I know one versus the other. I can't predict. But get away from zero, whether you go into the positive numbers or negative, doesn't matter. Just get away, because the number itself will go up if you get away from zero. And that's a stronger prediction. That's a stronger relationship between those two variables. So this correlation coefficient tells me that they're correlated at the 0.67 level. I don't care about the sign here. Strength doesn't care about sign. It's only about number. Number for strength. These two variables, whichever one they are correlated at 0.81. These two are at 1.0. This is also at 1.0. And by the way, if you are correlated at 1.0, let me go back, at 1.0, whether it's a negative one or a positive one, doesn't matter. If you are correlated at a negative one or positive one, it's a perfect correlation. That's why you cannot go lower than negative one or higher than positive one. They're both perfectly correlated, meaning if you tell me something about one variable, I can always correctly predict the other variable. And the sign will just tell me whether I'll go up or down in my next prediction. But I will always be correct. And by the way, that doesn't happen in behavioral science very much. In physical science, that tends to happen, but not so much in behavioral science. We don't, almost never would we ever get a negative one or a positive one in correlation coefficients. We don't tend to see those. These are fantastically strongly correlated. Woo, we'd be excited with that. We don't tend to get negative ones. But that's what strength is. Strength is represented with the number and the correlation coefficient. The sign, here I made them in red here, so now just the sign we're interested in, it tells us the direction or which type of correlation it is, either positive or negative correlation. That comes specifically from the sign. So these two values or variables, whatever they are correlated at a negative 0.67, which by the way is this is roughly what Starbucks found between coffee sales and temperature outside. They're correlated, you don't need to remember that, but it's just interesting, at roughly negative 0.67. It's the negative sign that tells us the direction, that it is a negative correlation, meaning as the values of one variable go up, temperature outside, the values of the other variable go down, hot coffee sales. Here, it's a positive sign, So it tells us that these two variables are positively correlated, meaning as values of one go up, the other one also goes up. As one goes down, the other one also goes down. That's what that sign tells us. And again, there's a negative and a positive. And when there's no sign, or I mean, when it's a zero, it doesn't tell us because there is no relationship to predict. So it doesn't tell us there's no positive or negative zeros. It's just zero. We've got no predictive value. So again, the sign tells us the direction. So in a correlation coefficient, we see the little r, we see an equal sign, we see a sign and a number. The number tells the strength, the sign tells us the direction of the correlation. All right, so that was all really important. So I want you to take a quick practice here. Say there was research done and I found out that the more students laughed in class, the more positive they rated the class. And based on that limited information, which of these three correlation coefficients down on the bottom represent the strongest correlation for this type of relationship? And I really want you to try and guess this. This is really important. And if you need to pause the lecture here, this is a great place to pause it and really give yourself a chance to read this. This is something you need to be able to work out. And I italicized important word strongest, and I underline important phrase, this type of relationship. Okay, so here's what we're talking about. I want you to do some arrows. So I found out that the more, I put an arrow going up, students laugh in class, the more positive, another going up arrow going up, arrow going up. What does that tell us right off the bat? What type of relationship do these two variables have? Both arrows are going up. That means they agree. Doesn't matter if they're both going up or both going down. Because they agree, we know right off the bat the type of relationship is positive. So it's got to be a positive number. Oh, that's a potential. That's a positive one. This one is not even an option because it's a negative sign. Not even an option. And this one is still an option. But we're looking for the strongest. And strongest has to do with number. And it is the largest number. Which of these two is the largest? Of 0.44 and 0.75? 0.75 is. So that correlation coefficient represents the strongest correlation for the type of relationship we've described in that study. So you should be able to work that out. How about another example? Here's another example. Okay, so say a study found that the less students used their cell phones during lecture, the more they understood the topic being discussed, which, by the way, this was also done and this was also found. The less students used their cell phones during lectures, the more they understood the topic being discussed. And the question to you is, based on that information, which of these represents the strongest correlation for this type of relationship? Pause me again and work this out and give yourself a good guess. Okay, so again, let's go back and put some arrows. Study found that the less students use their cell phone, the arrows going down, the more they understood the topic being discussed. I would put one going up, one goes down, one goes up. Boom, what type of relationship do they have? Negative. Okay, I just made this super easy because how many negative options do you have? You only have one. So it is the strongest because it's the only one out there. But you'd have to remember that you're looking for this type of relationship. In this case, it is a negative correlation, so you have to have the negative sign. And if I had negative 0.84, and if this one happened to also be negative, or any of the other ones, this would still be it because it is the strongest negative correlation. Even if they were all negative, this would still be the strongest. But in our example, it was the only negative. So that is the answer. If you're having trouble with the last two examples, you need to stop and spend a lot of time letting that sink in. Or when you come back and study, go back to here and spend some time with these examples. All right. Now that you know all of that about correlations, it's really important to mention this. Correlation does not equal causation. It doesn't imply causation. It doesn't suggest causation. Correlation does not equal causation. I can't emphasize that enough. What that means is just because two variables are correlated, and they can be so strongly correlated they knock your socks off, but it doesn't mean one causes the other. And there are lots of reasons why that's the case, but I'll let you know. The statistical analysis used to create a correlation coefficient, used to derive a correlation coefficient, doesn't allow for causation to be assigned. And that's a lot of gobbledygook, and all it means is that you cannot simply tell with correlation methods whether there's causation. Two problems that could come up are on your outline, and you need to know these two problems. One is called a directionality problem, and one is called a third variable problem. So the directionality problem suggests that, or is defined as, a correlation does not tell you if one variable causes another. Because you don't know which one to start with. Do you remember that the arrow goes both ways in a correlation? So you don't know, the chicken or the egg come first. You don't know which one to start with, and you got to know, if you're going to assign causation, which one actually causes the other one. And the correlation doesn't allow you that ability. So here's a good example. If there's a relationship between coffee sales and temperature, and it's a negative correlation, which we talked about it is. If researchers concluded that if you were going to assign causation, then you would have to conclude that declining coffee sales cause temperatures to go up. Because remember, correlations can go either way. So what you want to say is high temperatures cause low coffee sales. But correlations, remember, you got to be able to go back and forth. So you're going to say that, you should be able to say that declining coffee sales cause temperatures to go up. Well, that's ridiculous, isn't it? That's a directionality problem. You cannot assign causation to two variables that are correlated. They're just correlated. It doesn't mean they cause each other. Now, you can also have a third variable problem, meaning that the correlation doesn't tell us if we've assessed all important variables in this relationship. So a third variable problem tells us, it's defined as the correlation doesn't tell us if we've assessed all important variables in this relationship. Here, let me give you an example of what that means. I'm going to give you two variables, ice cream sales and crime. If you take macroeconomics, by the way, they actually will use this example as well. Ice cream sales and crime, it turns out, and I kid you not, that these two variables are indeed strongly correlated. And by the way, they're positively correlated, if you're wondering. As ice cream sales increase, crime increases. As ice cream sales are low, crime is also low. Now, if we wanted to assign causation, it starts to sound ridiculous. And I'm telling you, these really are. If you look at any city, in any country, ice cream sales, when they're the highest, crime is the highest, and crime is the lowest, ice cream sales are the lowest. If you want to start assigning causality, what would you say? When crime is high, I drown my sorrows by eating ice cream. So more ice cream sales. Or when ice cream sales are low, I don't know why crime would be low. I can't even come up with causality there. It's just too ridiculous. So although these two are strongly correlated, the causation doesn't even work. You can't even logically assign causation. And here's the reason. They are indeed strongly correlated with each other, because there is a third variable. And that third variable is outside temperature. And the third variable problem says that you can't tell if you've assessed all important variables to this relationship. If you don't tell your computer to include the values for outside temperature, it never will. But it will tell you that as ice cream sales increase in cities, so does crime. As crime is low, so is ice cream sales. If you don't tell it to assess outside temperature, it won't. And maybe it's the outside temperature that causes ice cream sales to go up and crime. Because when it's warm, they both go up. And when it's cold, they both go down. So perhaps we were looking at a third variable problem all the time. That it was that third variable that actually had the causation relationship with them, and not they don't have one with each other. Even though they are indeed, ice cream sales and crime are indeed strongly correlated. Just remember, there's two potential problems if you start trying to assign causation to correlated variables. Okay. So we do know the correlation does not imply causation. But what if we want to explore causation? What if we really are interested in whether being extroverted causes people to be happy? Or maybe high values of happiness cause people to be more extroverted. What if we want to assign causation? Because we do. Well, for example, if I want to know if a particular drug works on depression or anxiety, I have to start talking about causation. I have to say this drug causes a decrease in anxiety symptoms. I better start talking about causation if I want anybody to buy the drug. So we have to pick a different design. We cannot use correlational designs. Here's another example of a third variable problem, by the way, using personality characteristics, self-esteem, and extroversion and happiness. It's another nice example of a third variable problem. So if we want to know about causation, here's what we need to do. We need to do an experiment. We need to have experimental methods. So experimental methods, capital B on your outline, that's a design that allows inferences about causes and effects to be drawn. These are methods used to explore causality, and I would underline causality. That's really important to remember. If I want to say one variable causes another, I have to do an experiment. I have to look at experimental methods. I cannot rely on correlational data. It doesn't matter how strong the correlation is, it doesn't suggest that one causes the other. To look at causality, I have to do an experiment. So let's talk about experimental methods. So we're going to go more in depth than your book does here. I think your book glosses over this. I think it's expecting everybody to remember this from your Psych 101. And if you do, bravo. If not, we're going to go back again and just make sure everybody's on the same page with what experimental methods means and what an experiment really is. Let's talk about the basic logic of an experimental design. Why experiments are so powerful. Here's the basic design. 2 or more participants are compared at the outset. So you've got 2 groups. You can have more, but at the very minimum, you have to have 2. And they are these 2 groups are as similar as you can make them at the outset. And then you treat them the same, but one of the groups you tweak something. You tweak something in one group. And then at the end of this, you measure both groups on the same construct, whatever it is you're interested in. Because you started with as similar groups as possible, you treated them the same except for that one thing you tweaked for one group only. And then in the end, you measure the same outcome. If they don't score similarly, you can start saying, oh my goodness, it might be that thing I tweaked. That thing I tweaked may have caused the different outcome scores in the end. That's the basic premise of an experiment and why you can start assigning causality. So let's break it down into your outline. Let's start talking about what your outline's got here. 2 key requirements of an experiment. So first of all, we have to have equivalence of participants, and that's just what we said. Ensuring that participants in each experimental condition are equivalent to each other, as equal as possible. So you're going to ensure that participants in each experimental condition are as equal as possible. That's what equivalence of participants means. And by the way, you're going to accomplish that through random assignment. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. That's a nice little note here too, that can accomplish equivalence of participants through random assignment. The other key requirement of an experiment on your outline, manipulation of variables. The experimenter has to manipulate something. They're going to manipulate one of the variables. By the way, we call it the independent variable. So the experimenter manipulates the independent variable and then measures the effects of that manipulation on another variable, which we call, by the way, the dependent variable. So manipulation of variables. Experimenter is going to manipulate variables. And it just happens to be called the one they manipulate, the IV, and then they're going to measure another variable. Everybody gets measured on the other variable. We call that the dependent variable. We're going to do a little bit more in depth of IV and DV in a minute. But that's the basic. Those are the two basic requirements of an experiment. How do we satisfy those two requirements? Okay, first of all, random assignment. Random assignment is defined simply as the assignment of participants by a random process to each group. It is what it says it is. It's the assignment of participants by a random process to each group, to each experimental group. Each participant who participates in this experiment has an equal chance of being in either group. That's a random assignment. And by the way, that ensures, like the PowerPoint says, ensures equivalence of participants. It's important to remember. Here's a real life example, and this happens all the time. If I take people into an experiment and people who will volunteer, if I said to my classroom, hey, here's a pill, and this pill will help you pay attention for about an hour or so. It's going to increase your ability to pay attention. And you're thinking, heck, I got her for 55 minutes. I'll do anything to pay attention better. Give me that pill. So half of you volunteer to take this random pill I just happen to have. And the other half of you are going, that's kind of ridiculous. I don't know what she has in there. I don't really know her. I'm going to take a pill. Well, that's okay with me. So if I did this experiment and half of you volunteered and half of you didn't volunteer to take the pill, and I, at the end, and I looked at the effects of the pill on people, well, I can't do that. Because I didn't start out with two groups that were as equivalent as possible. I didn't equivalence of participants. One of my groups were volunteers who agreed to take a pill that they'd never seen before. The other group said no. So at the end, I think I'm going to assess ability to pay attention or attentiveness. But really, what I might be picking up is a risk-taking behavior or impulsiveness or ability to trust somebody, which none of those have anything to do with the pill. So because I didn't start with equivalent groups, I can't do that experiment. And boy, is that hard in research, because you're just so tempted to put all the people who agree to volunteer in one group and all of the non-volunteers in the other group. But you can't do that because you don't have equivalence of participants. So really what you end up doing is you get all the volunteers and then you divide them up. And you're at least trying to have as equivalent groups as possible to start with. All right, next way to satisfy the two requirements is experimental control. And we say that this is the ability of the researcher to determine the specific experiences the participants will have during the experiment. As much as possible, you're going to control this experiment and tweak things and keep everything else the same from the beginning to the end of your experiment. You want as much control, experimental control, as possible, so you can really determine the specific experience that all of the participants have. No matter what group they're in, you want to control everything they're exposed to and what they do all the way so that you know if there's a difference ultimately, that it was due to that one thing that you did tweak. This idea of experimental control leads us to the idea that we have two different groups. That helps us to have experimental control. When we talk about these two groups, I want to give you this example as we go into the next section. next section. So you could write this example down in your notes. It's a good example. Say I'm interested in whether drug A causes levels of anxiety to decrease. By the way, we have to do an experiment, you know, right away, because I got the word cause there. Does drug A cause levels of anxiety to decrease? So in my experiment, one group takes drug A, the other group does not. And then in 3 months, I'm going to assess levels of anxiety in both groups to see if it worked. Okay. So based on that, I've got one group of participants that's going to take the drug, and we call them the experimental group. So that is defined, experimental group. So we've got two groups, at a very minimum, just two. We have to have at least two, but you could have more. You could have more than one control group, but you have to have at least one experimental group and one control group. Experimental group is defined as the group of participants that received a manipulated experience of interest or the treatment of interest. That's our experimental group. They get the whole reason why we're doing this experiment. It gets given to, that thing we manipulated gets given to the experimental group. So in our example, the group that gets the potential anti-anxiety drug being studied, drug A, that's the experimental group. That's the manipulated experience, getting drug A. The control group then is the group that is treated the same way as the experimental group, as similarly as possible. The only difference is they do not receive the manipulated experience or treatment. So in our example, they do not take drug A. That's our experimental group. They do get the experience of interest, and the control group will not get it. Based on that, we've got two variables we're looking at, like we alluded to earlier. We have an IV and a DV, an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable, in any experiment, you always have to have one of each, at least one of each. The independent variable is what you're purposefully varying in the study. What are you manipulating, varying? That's your IV. It's the experience that the experimental group is exposed to. And by the way, how I remember this when I was learning this myself is the I. So you got to know the shortened IV abbreviation of it. So independent variables IV. So I remember this by like, why am I doing the study? What did I think would matter? Why am I researching this? Because it's that thing that you're manipulating that you want to know if it really does have an influence ultimately. And the dependent variable is the variable that you ultimately measure. Everybody gets measured on the DV, on the dependent variable. So in our example, what is the IV? It's drug A. What is the DV? What do we measure in everybody? Levels of anxiety. And by the way, this is a great example to have in your notes. So if you've got this example running, keep adding to it. That you already have experimental group, control group, now write IV, DV. So the IV is drug A. That's the thing we tweaked. We gave drug A to one group. By the way, who did we give it to? We gave it to the experimental group. They're the group that gets drug A. The control group does not get drug A. Oops, there we go. The group that does not get drug A is the control group. And then ultimately, what are we measuring everybody on? We're looking at everybody's level of anxiety. So that means the DV is our level of anxiety, the levels of anxiety of our subject. That's the DV. Okay. That is the basic lowdown of what an experiment is and the experimental method and why that is used to assign causation. Because we're really manipulating things. We're holding everything else constant, but one thing, the IV. And if at the end their scores on the DV are different between these two groups, we can start saying it must be that thing we tweaked in the experimental group that caused them to score differently on the DV. And we start looking at the term cause. It must have caused the difference. taking drug A must have caused lower levels of anxiety in the experimental group because they're statistically significantly lower than the control group in levels of anxiety. And that's a term, statistically significantly. Let's talk about statistical significance, because that's a term you'll see when you see research being reported, especially in journal articles. In regard to an experiment, statistical significance means that it's the probability that the difference between the experimental group and the control group, so the group that got the IV and the group that didn't get the IV, that the difference between those two groups is real or significant. This means that the difference most likely did not occur by chance. So if we say there is a statistically significant difference in the levels of anxiety in persons who take drug A, being compared to persons who, the group who did not take drug A, we mean that the difference in anxiety levels for group A most likely did not occur by chance, that it really was due to the manipulated variable, drug A. Now, when we start saying how significant is it, you'll see written something like p less than 0.05. So that'll come after the statement where it says there's a statistical significant difference between these two variables. And you'll see in parentheses often p less than 0.05. Now, when you see that, it's important to remember what that means. That p less than 0.05, the probability level, the p, means that the difference between the experimental and the control group would most likely occur by chance only 5 times out of 100. That's why it's 0.05. It's 5 out of 100, 5 in hundreds. So if the experiment were repeated 100 times, only 5 times would the difference be due to chance. All the other times, it's going to be due to the IV. So when you get a statistical significance level such as p less than 0.05, that says something. Statistically, that's very strong. And we don't even start reporting statistical significance until we reach p less than 0.05 level. Probability less than 5 out of 100, meaning that only about 5 times out of 100 is it due to chance. At about 95 out of 100 times, it's actually the IV. And for science, we've determined that that's enough. That's enough for us to pay attention. P less than 0.05. So you do need to know what that means, what that suggests. Okay, so we've just done correlational methods. We've just done experimental methods. Now let's talk about case study. So case study, defined up there after the yellow term. It's the life of one person in particular being studied in depth. So what we do is you see people of interest being studied who have unusual character, they live unusual lives, they do unusual things of interest, things that would excel at something. Someone with multiple personalities. Somebody who's a serial killer. Somebody who's influenced the world, like a Martin Luther King Jr. Or Mahatma Gandhi. Oprah. It's been an interesting case studies done with someone like Oprah. So what a case study is you look at someone, one person, in depth. And you use any technique you think of, lengthy interviews, journals they've done, letters they've written, accomplishments, anything you can do to study them as in-depth as possible. And here's an example. They looked at Ted Bundy, and if you don't know who Ted Bundy is, he's a very famous serial killer. And some of you may choose to write about him as the person of interest later on in the chapter, because you can choose a serial killer. Now, what they did, I'll give you a little background on Ted Bundy. You don't need to remember him specifically, but he's a great example. So I'm going to give you a little background. Let's see, Ted Bundy. People described him as good-looking, charming, intelligent. He was ultimately convicted of killing 3 women, but he's suspected of raping and killing probably 100. He confessed to over 30, but they think the number is probably closer to 100 in about 5 years. And that was in the 1970s. And there are cases in Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and Florida that they believed he was the killer. Now, case studies spend a lot of time exploring what drove him to, he not just killed, but in the vast majority of times he also raped his victims. So they're interested in, these case studies were interested in what drove him to rape and kill. Okay, so then we had all these hypotheses. Some of the hypotheses were that he was adopted by his grandparents and he never knew his biological father, which is true. He was raised as the sibling of his actual biological mother. So what happened was his mom got pregnant very young, gave birth. Her very conservative parents were completely freaked out and said, we'll let you keep the baby, but we're raising him, and you will then be known as the baby's sister, older sister. And that's how he was raised for a long time. That's what he believed. His grandparents were his parents. His mother was his sister. So when they were doing this case study, they felt like, okay, that's an important piece of his puzzle. He had a failed career as a lawyer. At one point, he was rejected by his fiancee, who he adored. She was higher status of him, had a higher status. She didn't believe that he was ever going to become enough, that he was, in essence, not good enough for her. And she's pretty clear about that. And she rejected him and broke off the engagement. And the hypothesis of people doing the case studies on him believed that that impacted him and that created such hostility in him toward women. And then he also felt hostility because he ultimately found out that his mother was really who he believed to be his sister. And he felt very betrayed by her, that she waited until he was an adult to disclose this really important information to him. So the case studies say, okay, links to his previous situations seem to potentially have influenced his unusual behavior, in this case serial killing and raping. When they looked at his past in depth, what they found was he had a classic antisocial personality disorder. And people used to use the term sociopath. You'll read about it in the last part of our textbook, and we'll talk about it as antisocial personality disorder. That's characterized by grandiosity, extreme feelings of entitlement, preoccupation with unrealistic fantasies of success, strong desire for power, complete lack of empathy for other people, long history of deceitfulness, repeated failures to meet expectations of work and school, and high levels of interpersonal exploitiveness, meaning you exploit other people, take advantage of other people. So he really met all of those. He was the classic antisocial personality. He also showed these early behaviors that they thought were really interesting. They ended up calling it the serial killer triad. He tortured animals when he was young. He started destructive fires. And he bedwet until he was pretty old. So any one of those, not that interesting. But when you put the three together, significant torturing of animals when he was very young, and then starting many destructive fires, and then also bedwetting, they found that in him, and they believed that to be an interesting link. That his case study revealed that aspects of his individual life, as well as his common personality disposition, this antisocial personality disposition, was linked with the outcome of being a serial rapist and killer. And they called, by the way, those three, again, characteristics of torturing animals, setting destructive fires, and bedwetting as the serial killer triad. People who have those three don't necessarily become serial killers by any means. But when it tends to be what they were hypothesizing is when it's also linked with an antisocial personality disorder, and you have a serial killer triad, then you see unusual behavior as that person ages. And those were done from case studies, but what was interesting is the theory that came out of this. So let's talk about advantages of case studies. So advantages of the method. Advantages of the methods of this method is two. I'm gonna focus on two advantages. First, you can find out a great deal about somebody. So you can find out about the personality of someone in great detail. You really learn about someone in great detail. That's a really big advantage. You can learn about an interesting person in depth, whether it's a Ted Bundy or Martin Luther King Jr. You can learn about someone in depth by using a case study. It's really interesting. The second advantage is that this type of exploration can give insights into personality that can be used to formulate a more general theory that would then need to be tested or explored with a larger sample. Because remember, we're only talking about one single person. But why it's an advantage is it can help you formulate these general theories that would then need to be tested or explored on a larger sample, like the serial killer triad theory. So what they did is they identified this by a case study on Ted Bundy, and then they looked at other famous serial killers, and boom, they started seeing the serial killer triad. That they had those three traits, and when you pair that with an antisocial personality disorder, you started seeing the behaviors of these adults as serial killers. So those are advantages of this method of a case study. Now, disadvantages, there's one major disadvantage of the method, and you can guess what that is. The results are very narrow because it's based on the study of a single person, and that case study alone cannot be generalized to other people. You need to do more research to test and explore on larger samples. So you're really left with one interesting case study. Now, if it's so interesting, like in this situation, it's so interesting, they then did start looking at other cases and other larger samples. That's what you do with it. But it's a disadvantage because all that work, you really just know about one person. And sometimes you don't find something as tangible as a serial killer triad to then go look at larger groups. But sometimes you do. So it's listed as a disadvantage because the results are very narrow because you're really only looking at one person at that moment in time. Okay, that's case study. Now, capital D on that one says, when do we use correlational experimental or the case study method? They all have strengths, they all have weaknesses. And sometimes the strength of one is a weakness of the other and vice versa. Some are better at answering certain questions than others. So a quick, brief review about what we've just been talking about this lecture. Correlational method. Like we said earlier, correlations are good at exploring relationships between variables that occur naturally in everyday life. And researchers don't set these up, they just occur, and then researchers look at the data. You look at relationships between variables that were involved. Like I said, the example between the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder rates and the proximity to the traumatic sites, to those sites where there were major events on 9/11. You couldn't create a natural disaster like that just to study it. That would be incredibly unethical. Like, for example, if you were looking at malnutrition in children and then later adult intelligence, if you wanted to see if there was a correlation between those two, you can't purposefully have a group of children that you don't allow to eat well so that you can look to see if their adult intelligence levels are affected. Again, not ethical, not going to happen. But we want to know if there's a relationship between variables that occur, like proximity to the events at 9/11 and PTSD diagnoses, or malnutrition as a child and later adult intelligence ratings. So you do want to know those things, but you can only get at them with a correlation, in a correlational method. So Correlational methods are convenient. We can look at a lot of variables at once, and we can look at relationships very, very nicely. And we can start looking at predicting. But remember, what's the one thing correlational methods cannot tell us about? Causation. So if we want to look at causation, which we do, you often start with a correlational design. Like when they found that higher levels of alcohol in the bloodstream led to lower ability to make quick decision or reaction time. So higher alcohol intake, lower reaction time. That was a very strong negative correlation. They start with a correlation, but they said, heck, we really do need to know about causation. We need to know if one causes the other. We absolutely need to know that. So then they took it to the next level. And they actually then manipulated variables. They started with two groups as similar as possible. They gave them alcohol. They took one thing, alcohol. The other group had the same, but it was non-alcoholic beverage. They had an alcoholic beverage, so they had them do a task which assessed reaction time. And boom, they found there to be a difference. So they started with correlation method, but then they, because they wanted to explore causation, moved it to an experimental method. And that's what happens in the real world if you can. Now, like I said, in some situations, you can never have an experimental method. You could never purposefully have a group of children that you do not allow to eat well so that they become malnourished, so that you can then study them down the road. You would never be able to have an experiment that does that. So you have to stop at correlation methods for that. But in some situations, if you can have an experimental method, that's what you would do to explore causation. And then the third case study method, we said that is a great tool to generate a theory based on the study of one person. And if you can then go and study other people and generalize it, that's fantastic. Exploring it with larger samples of people could be the next step. So you might start with some correlational data on someone, and then you go and you start looking at other people so that you can generalize it. Case studies, you wouldn't be looking at being able to experiment. Like again, if you're looking at serial killers, you can't make somebody a serial killer. You can't manipulate that one thing about a group of people, nor would you ever want to. But you can look at other serial killers, and so from one case study, you could then look at correlation data on many other serial killers. So there we go. So which design a researcher uses is really going to depend on, it's going to depend on their research question. Am I just trying to look at a relationship? Then I'm going to do correlational design. If I'm going to assign causation, I've got to do an experimental design. If I really don't know enough about this topic to look at lots of people right now, I'm going to look at one person in depth. I'm going to do case study. So it's really about your research question, the goal of the research. And taken together, these three designs provide complementary methods for exploring personality. Like I said, sometimes one leads to another, and sometimes one can support the other one. And that's when you use correlational, experimental, and case study methods. And that's the end of this chapter.